Hey everyone, I'm Danny Jack, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about my basic settings for wedding photography. So I'm a wedding photographer based in the UK. When I'm not shooting weddings, I like to help other photographers turn their craft into a business, whether that be with marketing or branding or productivity or business mindset, any of that kind of stuff. If that's something you're interested in, feel free to check out the links below. There's a website called Shot Takers with some courses in there, some resources, some stuff you might find useful. But on with the video. So in this video, I want to talk about the settings I use for wedding photography. Obviously, every wedding is different. I'll be using different settings. We're going to go through all the basics. So we're going to go through like shutter speeds I use, what shooting modes I use, what focus modes I use, what exposure modes I use, that kind of stuff. Like, we're not going to go too deep into the menus, but all the basic settings that I would use on a wedding day. Of course, it goes without saying that every photographer is different, every photographer has a different way of shooting. This is just what works for me. So some of this stuff might work for you, some of this might not work for you at all. Maybe you might, pick just a couple of bits here and there. Yeah, but I just wanted to make this video just to show you how I do it, and hopefully it might be helpful. So this is my wedding camera. This is the Sony a7 III. I have two of these, one of them here, one of them recording the video there. And I've been using these cameras now for, I think, a couple of years. I think they're great. They're my first mirrorless cameras. I was kind of split between these and the Fuji X-T2, but I went with the Sony instead. I think X-T2 or X-T3, I can't remember. But yeah, so I've gone with Sony, and so far I love it. I love shooting weddings with these. I think they're, small and lightweight and, great for autofocus, that kind of thing. So some of these, I guess, settings may apply more to Sony, but it should be pretty universal, I think. So firstly, the two modes I use mostly on a wedding day are aperture priority and manual. So I'm probably shooting about 50-50 for both, and it depends on kind of where I am, what the lighting is like. So for example, if I'm outside, if the light is going to change quite often, if it's more important that I get the shot as opposed to getting the exposure absolutely perfect, I'll probably go with aperture priority. I just find it's much better for like run and gun kind of stuff. I'm not super quick at exposing manually, at least not as quick as the camera can be in terms of making choices, so that's why I use aperture priority for that kind of stuff. When I have a little bit more time to work with, or when the light conditions stay constant, then I'll shoot in manual. So that might be for a ceremony, for example, if it's indoors, or for things like speeches, or the evening when I'm using a flash or a camera flash, then I'm normally shooting in manual. So in terms of the actual settings I'll use, I'll start with talking about aperture priority and then I'll move over to manual. With aperture priority, normally I am shooting around f2. Obviously this depends on, what's going on, what I need to capture, what kind of depth of field I want. If I'm going to use depth of field as like a storytelling device, I might make that a bit wider. Yeah, normally around f2 is kind of where I shoot most of a wedding day. I think that works for things like portraits, and just to kind of like separate the background, get that nice bokeh effect. But yeah, so if maybe it's a bigger group or something, I might go down to f5.6, or for like confetti, when I did a confetti walk, maybe that's like an f8, but apart from that, I'm on f2. Shutter speed wise, I'm at 1/125th of a second normally, or 1/250th of a second, depending on if my ISO can handle it. So if I'm outside, there's nothing wrong with me being on 1/250th of a second. If things generally aren't moving, so if I'm photographing, like the venue itself, or, shoes, I guess, things which just don't move on their own, 1/125th of a second is absolutely fine. I can even go down lower than that if I need to, but that kind of is a kind of like nice, safe spot to be at for most of a wedding day, and obviously anything faster than that, that's absolutely fine. I tend to not be trying to capture like motion blur or anything like that on a wedding day, so I want things to be pretty static. So 1/250th or 1/125th is absolutely fine for me. What's really cool about the a7 III and probably a lot of other cameras now is that you can set a minimum shutter speed. So I set that as my minimum shutter speed, 1/125th or 1/250th, and that way, no matter what I'm doing, no matter how dark it's going, it's not going to go lower than that. Instead, it will push the ISO up instead. That way, even if I'm shooting on aperture priority, I haven't got a risk of suddenly going into a dark area and suddenly things getting blurry. Again, like I say, most of the settings I use are so that I can make sure I actually capture the moment, and maybe it might take a little bit more time for me to edit than if I was shooting full manual all day, but I find I prefer to do this and make sure that I'm covering myself, making sure that I'm not missing anything. That's aperture, that's shutter speed. The other thing I always set is my ISO, and when I'm shooting on aperture priority mode, my ISO is set to auto. So what I mean by this is that, it will make its own decision on what the ISO will be, but I can set a minimum and a maximum on that on the a7 III. So I would set a maximum ISO of, I think, 10,000 or 12,000, This is pretty good at handling low light, so if you push the ISO to 12,000, actually they're pretty usable images, so I'm quite happy for it to be there. 10,000 probably is a better bet. It's not very often I'd need to push the ISO higher than 10,000. It'd have to be really, really, really dark, and in which case I should probably put some lights up or something. So yeah, around 10,000 is my maximum. That way I'm not going so far that the images are so grainy or noisy that I can't use them, but also I can go high enough that my shutter speed is not really going to be compromised, even in a low light situation. White balance I just set to auto. I know that this takes longer for me to fix in post, but I would rather do that and risk missing anything so that I can focus on actually capturing what's in front of me instead of changing my white balance. Like I say, I'm not quick enough to do it, so I just set it as auto, and it's pretty close most of the time, and I can just sync up white balances in Lightroom later on. So that's it for when I'm shooting in aperture priority. Now, when I'm shooting in manual, things are a little bit different. I do tend to set everything up when I'm shooting in manual. So I will set my aperture to, I guess, about f2 again, once again, depending on what I'm shooting. Shutter speed, again, maybe about 1/200th of a second, possibly. I guess, once again, it depends. If people are moving, I'll get a little bit higher. So for during a ceremony or anything like that, where I know there might be a bit of movement, or if people are doing, like confetti runs and stuff, that'll be higher again. Then when I'm shooting in manual, I will move my ISO as needed. The ISO is probably the thing I'm moving most often when I'm shooting in manual. I tend to set my aperture and shutter speed, and then I'm just adjusting my ISO depending on if it's a bit too dark or a bit too bright. So when I'm in aperture priority, if the image is underexposed or overexposed a little bit, and I can see it through the viewfinder, great thing about obviously shooting mirrorless is that you can see the image before you take it. There is an exposure compensation dial on the Sony, so you can put this up to 3 stops, plus 3 stops, or minus 3 stops, depending. And that will probably get me most of the way there. If, for example, I want to do something like a silhouette or anything like that, then I can just quickly switch over to manual, and then I can set up a silhouette. And if a camera doesn't really know what I'm trying to achieve, I'll switch to manual. And in manual, I will set the white balance as well. So, for example, during a ceremony, when I know that the light is going to stay exactly the same, I will set the white balance at the start. And that way, the only reason I'm doing it really is just so that it's a lot quicker for me when I'm editing. I know that during the entire ceremony, I don't need to change the white balance. I just set it once and then it's done, and just saves me time later on. So that's it for shooting modes. So focus modes I use on a camera, I kind of vary it depending on what it is I'm shooting. Most of the time I'm using what is known as a medium flexible spot, which is something you can control with either the touchpad on the back, or you can use a little joystick, and you can kind of move around where you want to focus. And that's kind of what I'm using most of the day. I actually use the touchpad on the Sony, so you would just literally just touch where you need to focus, on someone's face or something like that, and then you will focus, and then you can take the picture. And I find that works really well for me. I came from a Canon 5D Mark IV, where it was very much like the touchpad technology. So I found that this was quite natural for me to use when I started using the Sony. I probably wouldn't say it's the best technology yet, the touchpad stuff, but it gets the job done. It's pretty quick. Yeah, I would rather use that as opposed to using the joystick. I also use the Sony's eye focus feature, which is amazing. I think it's one of the best things about the camera. For those who don't know, basically you can set it up so that if it sees an eye in the image, it will recognize that eye and you can focus on that eye, which is awesome because, when we're shooting weddings, normally we want to get people's faces in focus. So yeah, finding someone's eye, switching onto eye focus is awesome. Works really, really well. It's great for things like portraits and stuff when I want to make sure that eye is the sharp thing in the image. Great things for group photos, that kind of stuff as well. Exposure mode obviously doesn't matter when I'm shooting in manual, but when I'm shooting in aperture priority, what I do is I use the spot metering mode. So because I'm using the medium flexible spot, I set it up so that it would use that as the metering mode. So let's say, for example, if I put the focus point over someone's face, it will take the face as kind of the metering point. It will look at that and it will kind of expose that to neutral. I find this is really great for basically making sure that skin tones and the skin and whoever it is I'm photographing is kind of correctly exposed, and everything else kind of adjusts for that. So that's it for how I set up my camera for a wedding day. If you have any questions about any of that, please feel free to leave those in the comments. If you found this video useful, press like, press subscribe, press the bell icon. I do videos on wedding photography, but also on things like productivity and marketing and business strategy and just anything I feel like, really. So yeah, press subscribe, press like, that would be awesome. I'm going to do another video soon on how I set up my camera, so going into the settings, going into the shortcuts. Another cool thing about the Sony is it has loads of custom buttons as well, so I'm going to show you how I set those custom buttons up so that I can get to where I need to nice and quickly. Once again, thank you so much for watching, you guys, and I will see you on the next one.